Welcome, everyone. So glad to see so many folks here today. And we're going to go ahead and get started with our ethical guidelines for supervisory competence from theory to practice. I'm Robin Lang, and you will see probably right close to my image on the sidebar, my colleague and also supervisee, Rachel Hopkins. And so it's such a lovely experience to be able to present on supervision with a supervisee. And so Rachel and I have that context, and we'll be talking about both our experiences together in our supervisory relationship as well as others that we've had, and inviting you to really just get an overview of what it means to be following the ethical guidelines for supervision. Okay. So this program discusses strategies for complying with APA supervision guidelines and ethics codes, APA and other professions. It may not and does not include information on all applicable state laws, and any misapplication of this information, errors in the material, is possible that could result in non-compliance with your state law. So just be aware of that as you're going through. We accept trainees at UC-UBT from local institutions here in Utah, and so that is a conflict of interest. In terms of commercial support, we do not have any.
Thanks, Robin. So we figured we'd start just with some brief introductions about ourselves, even though some of you may know us in other contexts, even from other presentations that we've done. I thought, since we were presenting on ethics today and on supervision today, that I would, the photo that I would share today would be of, that's me and my grandfather after my graduation from graduate school when I got my PsyD, because when I think about where my kind of like internal gut check about my own code of ethics and how I want to be towards others, a big part of that has come from him, and he died last year. And so I feel really grateful to be able to have had him at that part of my life. And I also feel really grateful to get to share just a little snippet of him with you all today. I'm from the East Coast originally and have a Mountain West heart for sure. So that's why I'm out here now. My PsyD, though, is from the East Coast, right outside of Philadelphia, Widener University, which is, cool fun fact, the oldest PsyD program in the country. And I have a lot of gratitude because I was trained there by Dr. Linda Knaus, who is a big old ethics guru, who was also the former ethics chair for both APA and ABPP and a whole bunch of more organizations, especially in Pennsylvania. In terms of my time after my graduate degree, I actually began at UC-UBT as a postdoctoral fellow. So we'll talk about some role shifts and how that relates to supervision and ethics later. And so I've definitely had some experience with role shifts along the way in my postgraduate career. Some of my values I listed there, I'm hoping to really be able to engage some humor and some balance and hopefully some collaboration today. Definitely this has been a growth process for sure. And currently I supervise both licensed clinicians and unlicensed doctoral and postdoctoral trainees at our center, and also administrative staff. Today we're mostly going to be focusing on supervision of unlicensed trainees, but these other kinds of supervisions are things that Robin and I also both have a lot of interest and also experience in. And one theme that you might notice is a lot of graduate training programs have very minimal or no exposure to supervision content. So I feel really lucky that I got at least one really excellent supervision class while I was in graduate school. But really excited to keep building on that.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm an East Coaster too. Been out here for quite a while, though, so can align with much of what Rachel's presenting on and has shared about herself and her own journey out west. I think I've learned I'm officially now a mid-career counseling psychologist. I feel mixed about that, adjusting to being mid-career, no longer early. But it is so nice to feel like there's a lot of experience under your belt, which is great. Certainly was not my experience when I started supervising mental health providers. My very first experience with this was working in a group home in the Baltimore area for juvenile delinquent males and children, up to age 18. And I incidentally, even though I was just finishing my bachelor's degree, I had like the most mental health training of anyone who worked there. And so my first supervision experiences, I did not know what I was doing as a supervisor. And so really am hopeful that if any of you are finding yourself in a position of needing to supervise because you're kind of like the one who has the most training, that this presentation today will give you a really good overview of kind of where you can go and learn more and help you feel a little more grounded in what you're doing. Fortunately, after that, I got a lot of training in supervision. And 2009 is when I did take my first formal supervision course. My PhD is from the University of Denver. And another, like Rachel mentioned, another reason I think that the two of us were drawn to volunteer for a ethics related talk. This was the home of Karen Kitchener, and she is the 1983 author of the 5 ethical principles that we reference regularly in our mental health ethics. So the autonomy, justice, beneficence, non-maleficence, and fidelity. And so that was really imbued in my training as I went. And it's one of those things you just don't realize that not everyone's getting. And so after leaving there, I'm like, wow, yeah, that was such a cool experience to have. And this is a picture of me in the really lovely PhD regalia, getting my doctorate with my supervisor, Maria Riva, who really specialized as well in supervision, research, and training. And also Jennifer Cornish is from the PsyD program at University of Denver, and she's one of the co-authors of the APA 2004 Supervisory Competence Statement that the guidelines we'll be reviewing today are based off of. So a lot of really cool background in this area. Just in terms of orientation, because we will be talking about, there are often assumptions, right? That when you supervise, you are just going to use whatever your theoretical orientation is and kind of apply that to supervision. And some models certainly are that. And so just to orient you all to my perspective, I am definitely one with the third wave behavioral orientation. So like ACT and DBT, self-compassion is kind of a new passion area of mine, and specialized in PTSD training in particular. And that's what brought me to Salt Lake. All right, so for our agenda for today, we are going to we were talking about, this is not going to be like a full meal of supervision. It's going to be like an appetizer, tapas, which is really my favorite way to eat. But if you're still feeling kind of hungry for more, I felt that way. I want to validate it in advance. That's how I felt when I was putting together this presentation with Rachel, that there was so much more depth we wanted to do at each one of these sections. And so if you're feeling that way at the end of this talk, like you got kind of a taste of everything, but you really want to do more, please, when you fill out our feedback material, that should be, I believe, in your inbox already, please indicate what you'd like to know more about so that we can try and meet those needs in future presentations. But what we're gonna kind of cover, thank you, sorry, paused a little long there. Rachel's driving the slide train for me, which is great. We're going to cover supervision and just defining what that is. We're going to review just the APA clinical supervision guidelines and why we chose to focus on those for this talk, even though there are probably many professionals here from different backgrounds. Fortunately, it will still be applicable to you as well. We're going to talk about clinical supervision models, those ones that are based on theoretical orientation, as well as those that are more developmental in nature. We're going to touch on multicultural competence with regard to supervision. And of course, assessment of supervising and supervisor competence. legal considerations. I know we had several people write in with questions about kind of what we do for legal liability. So we'll try and touch on that. And then also some common ethical dilemmas that we might encounter when we're supervising. And of course, throughout, you're going to see lots of citations. If you want to read more about anything that we've cited here, the last slides, the further reading areas, you can go for support and exploration. We'll list off our source material, so you can actually go and look that up if that's something that's really piquing your interest. Okay, so starting off with what is supervision and what is not. All right, so this is from the APA's guideline document. Their definition of clinical supervision is a distinct professional practice employing a collaborative relationship that has both facilitative and evaluative components, that extends over time, has the goal of enhancing professional competence and science-informed practice of the supervisee, monitoring the quality of services provided, protecting the public, and providing a gatekeeping function. So that's like so much to cram into what you are supposed to do when you have your 45 minutes or hour weekly with your supervisee. So if you're feeling like, well, I don't know if I'm doing it right, am I doing good enough? I just want to validate that. It's a lot to do. So one thing that we, because we both obviously have employees at the Utah Center for Evidence-Based Treatment and also trainees, and also people who are both employees and trainees, like our postdoctoral fellows, and then of course, folks that are doing clinical work, we often are kind of asking ourselves, well, what's the difference between administrative supervision and clinical supervision? And so for administrative supervision, we're really focusing on their work as an employee and evaluating their work, their practices, also helping them kind of adjust to whatever the demands are, the needs of the organization. And the supervisor is considered to be like your boss. So that's true in my relationship with Rachel. I get to do her evaluations. I'm like the boss, which is just a really important power dynamic to acknowledge in any relationship. Clinical supervision, on the other hand, is focusing on the supervisee's functioning as a clinician, pretty much exclusively, and then monitoring and enhancing their therapy skills, particularly for trainees, monitoring their clinical relationships, any ethical issues, and supporting case conceptualization. So there's some different goals. And there are also overlapping goals. So there's some pieces that are like really just more clinical, and some that are really just more administrative. But then, of course, this whole middle section is the overlap of the two. And I don't know about you all, if you find yourself supervising any administrative staff, I certainly do. My experience is that it's hard for me to turn off that clinical part. And I do still tend to focus on developmental growth, even though it's not as a clinician necessarily, though many of our employees are also kind of on that trajectory anyways. And still, certainly in a mental health practice, we're also supervising our administrative staff on how to ensure client welfare. So this definition from Creedrer is like really helpful, but also it's still, like so many things, a little like blurry, but we're trying to pull it apart, parse it apart here. Consultation. So there was, I believe, a question about this. Consultation is more along the lines of sharing information between kind of a non-hierarchical relationship. So like two licensed providers, for example, we have lots of consultation teams here at UCBT where licensed providers are kind of taking a more collegial stance with each other. We're not generally directing each other what we have to do in those consultation meetings, but we're kind of providing, well, here's how I might approach that. It can be rejected completely. So the other provider might say, yeah, thank you. And I think that approach is probably not going to fit for me. And that's fine, because there's not a supervisory relationship in consultation always. There certainly can be. but not by definition. An important part, if we can go back just for a sec, Rachel, sorry. Important part is that legal liability for care is still held by the licensed clinician. So occasionally, I know our program directors and other clinicians here will have requests from other licensed folks for consultation. And that's something in our consultation agreement that we're reminding, like, we are going to give you our, 2 cents about what you could do here clinically. And also you are the licensed provider. This is your liability. You retain that liability and also the right to direct the care. Good. I have long pauses. I guess I'm learning that, Rachel. Okay. In counseling, okay, so counseling or therapy, we're addressing, so this is about whether we are doing therapy versus supervision, this slide. And that can sometimes be a question people have. Well, what exactly is the difference between what I'm providing to a therapy client versus what I'm providing to a supervisee? And so in counseling or therapy, we are addressing ineffective behaviors, unhelpful thoughts or intrusive emotions, and we're focusing on those goals and needs of the client. And an important point here is that ethically, our clients are able to go around, and we often encourage people to go around and interview multiple providers. So they have a lot of choice in who they are seeing for their therapy. And assessments may be conducted, but I'm not evaluating and grading anybody here. All right, so overview of our APA clinical supervision guidelines is what we're moving on to already. Moving right along. Okay, so there are many documents out there that address supervision and also how to do supervision with competence. And this is really great. It can be a little overwhelming though. Which ones are we going to look at? And so the reason that we selected the APA guidelines specifically is that we are going to choose guidelines that apply to our professional background. So Rachel and I are psychologists, but additionally, in developing these guidelines, the APA task force actually reviewed and drew from all of these other organizations and agencies. And so if you are, for example, a counselor, and you've reviewed their guidelines for supervision, you're probably going to notice a lot of similarities because they pulled from counselor guidelines. Also, social work is probably going to see quite a bit of similarity in terms of their guidelines. One thing I really like about APA guidelines is that they went ahead and looked at other countries as well. So we've got Australia, New Zealand, and Canada represented here as well. And my guess is about why did they not do more than that? I think they're looking mostly at our other English-speaking nations for ease there. It would be really cool. I wish they would pull from more. And perhaps, the version we're going to look at was published in 2014. And so perhaps they will be doing that in the next version. Okay, so we're moving on to those guidelines. And what we're going to do today, we're not going to, so the guideline document, I've included a citation for it in the very back of this presentation. I believe it's about 14 or 15 pages long, and it includes all of these different domains. And we will be reviewing the domains and the major points under each domain today. We decided though, it's I have read this document, and it's also kind of a dry read. And so we didn't want to go through them just kind of A to G and then give you examples later. So what we've done, I'm going to tell you today or in this section, what all of the domains are. And then you're going to see them kind of popping up throughout the talk in different order, depending on when they're relevant. And so this is partially really intentional for the theory to practice components. What Rachel and I are really hoping for that you're able to walk away from today with this presentation is some actionable steps that you can take right now to work into your supervision that you're doing now, or if you're a supervisee, you can take back and say, hey, is this something we could try? And so though we will not have as much time as an all-day training where we could do breakout groups and practice and case vignettes as much as we would want, you will have some very specific tools to take away from here today. Okay. All right, so competence, and this is from the APA has a lovely psychology dictionary available on their website. And they have defined competence as the ability to exert control over your life, cope with problems effectively, make changes to one's behavior and one's environment, as opposed to the mere ability to adjust or adapt to circumstances. And one thing about competence is that it's both really representing, like, I don't know, when I think about competence, I'm thinking, gee, this is an incredibly high bar. Like I'm never going to achieve, for example, multicultural competence. When am I ever going to fully be embodying all of these things? But also it sometimes feels like a really low bar, like I'm just barely competent, just barely checking the boxes. And so competence really does embody a really wide range here. And an important thing to note about the guidelines that APA has provided for us is that they are aspirational. And so this is like setting an intention to go in this direction, and not that, you know, if you're not doing every single one of these perfectly, that you're a failure as a supervisor, but really just please have these in mind as kind of the direction you're trying to head. Okay, and this is an assumption that is underlying all supervision, that the supervisor is competent both as a professional mental health provider, I'm going to edit that, and also as a supervisor. So this is like, not only is it tough to imagine being completely competent in every single element as you're in your mental health identity, it's also now the assumption that you're going to be competent as a supervisor. And certainly for me, especially in that first experience, I did not feel that way in either realm. And even today, regularly, I still think, gee, I really need to do more. I want to do more to grow in this area. So if you're having any of those feelings arise as you go through this talk, I just want to validate in advance that that's very normal, common humanity, and like me too. All right, so I'm going to hand it over to Rachel to talk a bit about our clinical supervision models.
Thank you, Robin. We also had a question in the chat that I think I'll be able to touch on a little bit within some of the models, but if you had thoughts on that and wanted to reply there, just an invitation to. I think some of that will be sprinkled throughout though. So Robin alluded to the fact that we'll be sprinkling these domains throughout our presentation. And so when we're talking about these different supervision models, kind of the driving motivator behind this was this domain A, this first domain around supervisor competence. And like Robin already mentioned, that means competence both in terms of the psychological or mental health services that are being provided to the client by the supervisee. But it also means for the supervisor maintaining competence in supervision. There are a lot of different kinds of models of supervision. So these 4 areas are really broad categories that actually have just, gosh, like a ton of different specific models under them. I'm going to do my best to give a fairly equitable overview of a lot of these. But of course, I am not able to maintain competence in, I don't know, 20 different kinds of supervision models. And so there are probably some that I have a little bit more of an implicit bias toward, or just a little bit more of a felt or felt experience with. So there was a question around in the chat around addressing secondary traumatic stress in supervision, and how that would apply to Robin's slide around counseling versus supervision. And part of what makes that question hard to answer for me is that it probably depends a little bit on what kind of model of supervision that you're using. and what kind of orientation you're coming from. And so one starting place, when we're thinking about ethics early on, we're often thinking about like, what are the rules? How do I follow them? How do I do them right? And so what we're going for today is a little bit more of like how do I think through things ethically, and like what would be those critical thinking steps. And so one suggestion, if you have this kind of question, or even as other questions pop up today, is maybe thinking about how would it apply in this model, or how would it apply in this model, even if you're using one, just kind of flexing those different critical thinking skills a little bit. Luckily today, this is a low stakes scenario. There's hopefully no crisis happening, at least in the context of this supervision. And, our distress level can be low enough to have that like openness and curiosity about some of these things. I wanted to at least mention that a lot of traditional supervision models were based on this apprenticeship and master approach, where trainees really learned by observing experts. They observed them and then practiced under their expert guidance. And this learning was really considered a socialization process. So you're learning both clinical skills as well as cultural norms. And I think Robin might have alluded to this a little bit in the beginning, but one of the things that kind of remains true today about this is that a lot of us as new supervisors really proceed based on our own past experiences, which may or may not come from a specific model of supervision, or it may or may not be the actual model of supervision that resonates most with you as an individual. So in terms of our tapas today, feel free to take an extra bite later on if there's something here that you really enjoy. And if there's something that really doesn't resonate with you, there's no need to order it again or to force yourself to eat it. The first kind of category of different models that I wanted to address today, Robin mentioned her own theoretical orientation. And so this is really speaking to that, these different treatment-based models, which are models that are grounded in a specific kind of psychotherapy and the theory and orientation associated with that kind of therapy. So obviously this is not a comprehensive list of every kind of therapy that exists out there, but some common ones: cognitive behavioral, psychodynamic, acceptance and commitment, and humanistic. And they really, the things that are themes throughout these, even though they're different kinds of models, is that they draw on the clinical data that's inherent to that theoretical orientation. Meaning like what you're attending to as a therapist in the room are the same kinds of things that you would be attending to as a supervisor in the supervision context. There's also a piece that has to do with teaching the specific techniques of that theoretical orientation, which sometimes happens in a didactic way and sometimes happens in a more experiential or modeling kind of way. So just to kind of give, again, just like the broadest of overviews of some of the things that would be involved from these different theoretical perspectives. In psychodynamic therapy, we're attending to affective reactions, defense mechanisms, things like transference and countertransference. And so those would be the same kinds of themes that you would be attending to with your supervisee as well. A really important piece actually of both of these models here is that you're also attending a lot to the relationship between the supervisor and supervisee. And you'll notice that that'll be a theme throughout a lot of the different models that we review today. Especially in psychodynamic supervision, the field has really shifted quite a lot over the years. Early on, and this really, reflects the advancements in the field as well. Early on, the stance of a supervisor was as uninvolved, non-attached, but really an expert with knowledge and skills and authority. And supervision was very didactic. But especially starting in the early 2000s, that stance really shifted to being a lot more relational, participatory, collaborative, and really processing those different, psychodynamic or psychoanalytic themes in the interpersonal relationship with supervisees. This is where our concept of parallel process also has come from, which is something that I think has kind of transcended different models now as well. And it's hard sometimes to define these specific terms. So I liked having a nice little definition for parallel process, even though I feel like I use that term frequently. So in the supervision context, it is the supervisee's interaction with the supervisor that parallels the client's behavior with the supervisee as a therapist. And I probably won't read through every piece of these slides here, but again, just kind of listing in a more humanistic or relational approach, those same kinds of things. So the inherent assumptions of the model, what that supervisor stance would be, what that supervisor and supervisee's roles are, and then kind of belief systems about the relationship. You'll notice that those themes, probably unsurprisingly, are very different than the kinds of things that you would be attending to if you were coming to supervision from a cognitive behavioral or an acceptance and commitment therapy kind of theoretical stance. So any of those CBT terms that you have used or heard, so Socratic questioning, thought records, cognitive restructuring, those are the same kinds of things that you would be attending to in the supervision relationship as well. And one thing that I thought was really cool is this idea of really structuring the supervision session like you would a cognitive behavioral session. So starting with agenda setting, bridging from previous sessions, the content that was discussed then, assigning homework, which I feel like I did not do very much of early on as a supervisor. I had those, fragilizing urges to not give more work or to like be protective or to take that work on myself. And that's been a really nice piece to kind of add in a little bit later on, is to add, is to assign more specific homework or learning or things. And then capsule summaries. So summarizing kind of the themes or what you've talked about in that session. In that supervision session. Similarly, again, with ACT or an acceptance and commitment stance, you're really focusing on those core processes that are inherent to that orientation. One thing that I thought was really cool is there was a study on ACT supervision related to self-care. And maybe this is on my mind specifically because of the burnout presentation that we were doing last month, but there's a pretty cool study that was done in 2015. I think you pronounce it Pakenham or something like that. But trainees who received overt training in these ACT processes that are listed here actually had increased ability to foster a more self-care oriented attitude. So related to that secondary traumatization question, I would suspect that this might be true across a variety of different kinds of theoretical orientations, but at least in the acceptance and commitment therapy research, that focus on self-care can be built through the explicit teaching of these processes. The next kind of category of models of supervision are what we call developmental models. And these are models that are focused on the developmental stage of the trainee. They have a few things in common. There's a whole lot of different kinds of them, but a few things that they tend to have in common is that they tend to specifically define the developmental stage of the supervisee, anywhere from novice to expert. They emphasize defining the specific characteristics or behaviors and skills that are present in each of those stages. And they tend to use scaffolding to encourage the use of prior knowledge and skills to promote new learning. For supervisors using a model like this, one of the things that's emphasized is really accurate identification of the supervisee's current stage, and then relatedly providing feedback that is appropriate to the stage of development that they are in, while simultaneously promoting progress to the next stage. So like Robin talked about before, it's a pretty lofty goal, but that concept has always felt fairly anchoring to me. I have a little bit of a background as a developmental psychologist, and it's nice to think about development as an ongoing concept, and it certainly doesn't end at the end of a formal training experience, continues throughout the career. Alrighty. Oh, another thing I wanted to mention about this is that even when we're talking about those stage identifications, development is nonlinear. And so you could see a trainee who's in a more advanced stage in one domain of practice and a less advanced stage in another domain of practice. And so really encouraging a lot of flexibility with, what that intervention is that you're providing. And so if a person is really advanced in certain therapeutic modalities, but less advanced in assessment, they probably need a different kind of supervisory intervention when you're talking about those different things. I wanted to talk a little bit about this first model, the integrated development model, or the IDM, because it's actually one of the most researched and most developed models that's out there. And as you can see here, the IDM talks about 3 different levels of therapist development. It primarily focuses on trainees, whereas the next model we'll talk about when you're past the trainee phase. And again, like I was saying, supervisor is tailoring skills and approaches that really correspond to that trainee's level. So entry-level students or those earlier novice levels tend to have high motivation as well as high anxiety. There is a very much like other kinds of identity development models. It starts by really wanting to know what is the best answer or the right answer or the right thing to do. Low levels of autonomy and higher dependence on the supervisor. And so as a supervisor, you're really balancing that anxiety and dependence by being both supportive as well as more prescriptive. And you can see if you jump down to that level 3 there, that's really different than what a supervisor would be emphasizing with a more advanced trainee. We'd be emphasizing more autonomy and collegial challenge and being a lot less prescriptive. Probably still supportive though, I would imagine. The middle section there, or the middle level there, is really characterized by fluctuation between these 2 places. And then I thought it was cool. They had this level 3I, which stands for integrated. And I think that speaks a little bit to how we can have different levels of development in different domains. So level 3I is defined by supervisees reaching that level 3, more advanced trainee across multiple domains. I think Jen popped up this really awesome survey for us here around different kinds of developmentals and what level of trainee do you tend to supervise the most. I know responses are still coming in here. And the entry level had an early lead, but it's balancing out with mid-level right now. Looks like close to 50% of folks are primarily, it keeps changing. About 40 and 40% are supervising entry level and mid-level trainees, with slightly fewer supervising more advanced trainees. And interestingly, 0% at level 3I. Fascinating. We were talking about the polls before today, and now I don't know if I should click stop sharing or not. Oh, here we go. I'll click share results. I don't know if you can see it. And I'll stop sharing now. I won't go into all the depth here, but you'll have access to the slides so you can kind of read through these themes later on your own. I just wanted to mention this more lifespan developmental model because the first three sections really parallel the IDM that we were talking about. And then the remaining three really relate more to the therapist throughout their career. And it felt really nice to be included in that, knowing that developmental does not, as we all know, does not stop at a specific moment in time or once you get a piece of paper from an institution or anything like that. Let's see here. And yeah, I really liked a lot of the themes related to development here. So again, just kind of being curious about the topics that are offered to you here. And if there's anything that stands out that can serve as kind of a bit of an anchoring point for you as a supervisor, or something to help you feel grounded in particular ideas when you are working with your supervisees. The third grouping of supervision models are what we call process-based models. And these models focus on the supervision process. So this is what is done and what happens during supervision. So both what kinds of intervention the supervisor applies, their orientation, major events in supervision, and then also, of course, factors that are affecting the supervisory relationship and how that relationship is developing. Again, there's a ton of different models here, and we're just kind of providing a larger overview today. But two that I wanted to give a little bit more information on are first this discrimination model, and then the systems approach to supervision. So in the discrimination model, there are three areas of focus for supervision, those being intervention, conceptualization, and personalization, and then three roles that the supervisor can take, or three kind of stances the supervisor can take in supervision. So educator, counselor, or consultant. And then I was kind of chuckling to myself when I was reading this question. So the supervisor, or reading this information, the supervisor can respond in any one of 9 ways. It was kind of reminding me of those early days math problems when you're like, if Robin has 3 flavors of ice cream and Rachel has 3 kinds of toppings, how many different combinations of ice cream flavors and toppings can you make? And the answer is 9. So you can think about these in that way. And of course, because there are these different kinds of ways you can respond, and those needs will change a lot. It'll change both how you respond, both within the session and across sessions as well. So you can kind of match up your ice cream flavors and your toppings there, depending on what kind of process you're going for, what is needed by the supervisee in that moment. In the systems approach to supervision, all of the dimensions and the relationships that are mentioned here, the influences that are mentioned here, are really focused and connected by this theme of the supervisory relationship. The primary areas that the supervisory process would focus on are those 2 that I bolded and underlined there. So the functions of supervision, as well as tasks of supervision, while the other domains that are listed there really represent the context that will have really important but more indirect influences on the supervisory process. So there's obviously a lot more reading you could do on these, but again, if you're thinking, oh, that sounds really interesting to me, I'd like to learn more about this, this is kind of your buffet plate of all of these different models. The last that I wanted to, again, even more briefly mention are second generation models. And this really parallels, I think, where the field is going in therapy and changes that have happened in therapeutic models as well, where they're becoming a lot more integrated and a lot more evidence-based. I'm thinking about things like the unified protocol and things like that, where these different kinds of models, the categories are combined models, target models, and then common factors models. And you notice that they all integrate uh, things from the other models that we described. So combined models tend to integrate different aspects of multiple first generation models. The example I gave here was CBT theory integrated with IDM developmental concepts, for example. In target models, you're really highlighting particular concepts of competent supervision. So it might be some of those domains that we're talking about throughout. It might be certain areas of practice. It can vary a lot, but it goes across these different models that we've already discussed. And then common factor models tend to, again, focus on the different common aspects across various models that are here. And there was some really cool research. It looks like my text cut off there a little bit, so I'm sorry about that. But there was some really cool research about some of the recommended common factors of supervision. Again, that theme first and foremost of the supervisory relationship, but other things included, instilling hope, raising expectations, self-exploration and awareness and will insight and building those things, increasing expertise in a particular theoretical framework, exposure and confrontation of problems. So avoidance, which I really enjoyed seeing that as a common factors theme, acquisition of new learning, of course, and then mastery of new knowledge. And I think talking about one of those specific competencies, I will be giving it back to Robin now.
Yes, thank you, Rachel. That was a lot of material. So if anyone's feeling like, well, I was hoping that you would tell me there was one model and what to do. Again, compassion. I think many of us are probably feeling that way. And just knowing again that these are aspirational goals. And so this is something, if you are taking this, watching this talk with a group, that perhaps you can work together to continue your learning as a group in these areas and see, what if one of us what if we did a supervision book club and looked into some of these and talked about it. So I'm hopeful that this will be a really great jumping off point for more exploration. Multicultural competence is, again, one of those things I mentioned earlier that is feels like a very high bar. And yet, of course, in the next slide, you'll see that this is mentioned repeatedly in domain B, which is diversity in our APA guidelines. So we are as supervisors striving to develop and maintain self-awareness, attitudes, knowledge, and skills related to diversity and being competent in these areas. And so you'll see the word competence repeated over and over on this slide. It's interesting to note, I think on our next slide, what the terms are presently that are being used. And again, this supervision guidelines document was published in 2014. And a lot's happened since then. So one article that I really love, and I'm so glad to be able to cite here, was just published in 2022. And some of the authors are up at the University of Utah. So local authors here, which is very exciting. And they are reminding us that the more popular term now is multicultural orientation. And so breaking down a little bit, and we can certainly look back if we need to at the guidelines and think about competence, but often what that feels like for folks, particularly with regard to multiculturalism and diversity, is like, oh God, how am I ever going to have enough knowledge and skills to be competent here? And so I find that this term multicultural orientation really feels a lot more accessible for folks as a jumping off point, or even for more experienced folks who've been working on this for quite a while. So the components of multicultural orientation are cultural humility, which is more about like a stance. So multicultural orientation, as opposed to competence, competence is really more content driven, right? Like the knowledge, the skills, the behaviors, the content, whereas orientation is more process. And so cultural humility is an open stance towards the cultural identities and experiences of another person. And that might be a client, or it might be a supervisee. Cultural opportunities are moments where these opportunities arise to explore cultural identity. And so you can probably think about perhaps supervision sessions you've had where there may be content related to the client that is potentially a cultural opportunity coming up, like, reviewing tape, seeing like, oh, they alluded to their cultural background and the supervisee did not kind of inquire further there. And so we might refer to that as a missed cultural opportunity. This can also, of course, happen in supervision with our supervisees. And so same thing, I am the supervisor and my supervisee is a BIPOC clinician. And I have not taken the opportunity to discuss, for example, what it might be like for them to be working with someone who identifies as a white cisgender woman. So that would be a missed cultural opportunity on my part as a supervisor. So this cultural opportunities, humility, and comfort applies both to our relationships with clients and then also with our supervisees. Cultural comfort is that ability to engage with the material around cultural diversity with a sense of ease and confidence. And as Rachel alluded to, in terms of common factors for effective supervision, effective therapy work, avoiding avoidance is one way that we become more comfortable. And so practice is a really great way to develop our cultural comfort. So this article was addressing what are the impacts of the supervisor's multicultural orientation on supervision satisfaction. Really exciting study. I am a little sad when I'm looking for research on multicultural supervision that there is not as much out there as there has been in the multicultural therapy realm. And so this is a really lovely recent study, and I'm hopeful that we'll have more data as it comes in. But this study found that when supervisor cultural humility and attending to cultural opportunities within the supervisory relationship were effective, it was positively associated with trainee satisfaction with supervision. So what that means is if I am high, the supervisee is rating me high on cultural humility, and I'm taking those opportunities in the room with my supervisee to talk about our cultural differences, then that it has a positive impact on their rating of the relationship with the supervisor. So that is something that you can really take with you today and focus on in upcoming supervision sessions if it's something that you've missed, or continue to do if you are doing this. Interestingly, when the supervisor missed opportunities to discuss cultural identity of the client, it was not associated with trainee satisfaction. So if they were showing a tape and, we didn't point out like, oh, let's talk about the cultural components here of the client, that did not impact the rating of the supervisor. And so what that tells us, a lot like that common factors model that Rachel was showing before, that when we really focus on the therapy versus supervision, it's hard, the supervisory relationship, just like with therapy relationships, we notice more impact on perceived competence and perceived benefit of that relationship by the supervisee. So if you have limited time in supervision, which I always feel like I'm running out of time, focusing on those opportunities with the supervisee will give you your biggest bang for the buck. And you're really modeling in the room how to do this with a client as well through your own actions. Okay, so moving on to assessment of supervisee and supervisor competence. And that could be, like we were just discussing, we could be assessing, for example, multicultural competence. Domain D of our APA guidelines is about professionalism. And so there's only two points here. One is that we are modeling professionalism in our own comportment and in our actions. And we're teaching knowledge, skills, and attitudes associated with professionalism. And then also that supervisors are encouraged to provide ongoing feedback and evaluation towards meeting those expectations of professionalism. So there's so much that we're trying to teach our supervisees and help them learn. This first section of the assessment component of our talk today is about this domain D, professionalism. So this is one, and I believe we had a question in the chat a little bit about this, like what are the behaviors that we're hoping to see, and how would we be able to differentiate behaviorally between someone who's ready for practicum versus someone who is ready for entry into independent practice. And this is one, I think when we're converting it over, the citation for this one got lost, but this is one that is actually from Carol Fallender's website. And I had the joy of attending a full day training with her right before COVID, so in person and everything. And one really lovely component of that training is that she has posted all of these. So she's one of the authors of those 2014 guidelines. She is an expert on the California laws, particularly, that's where she's located. But her website includes all sorts of downloadable forms. And so this is kind of my summary of one of those more extensive documents on that website. And we'll reference the address in later slides, but I just want to make sure to give credit here where credit's due. So looking at what are some of these behavioral markers, and what are we talking about when we say professionalism? So what Dr. Fallender has broken this down as are these 5 areas: integrity, deportment, accountability, concern for the welfare of others, and professional identity. And these are just a few examples. Again, this document, the theme of our talk today is taking documents that are massive and trying to summarize them down into bite-sized pieces for you so that they don't feel so overwhelming, because that's how I feel when I look at like a 14-page outline. Oh, how am I gonna digest all of this? So if this is exciting to you and you want to learn more, again, I'll mention back when this link shows up later in the slides, I'll let you know that's where I got this one from, and you can look at all of the details. But just looking at, for example, let's look at integrity. So readiness for practicum. So when folks are coming out of their program, perhaps their first year or second or third, depending on the program, and their their department is evaluating their readiness for practicum, they're going to be looking at, does this person understand professional values, honesty, and personal responsibility? And so we don't need to know that they're implementing that, but that they conceptually understand this. Internship ready. So this is in theory. I've had lots of practica, and I'm actually ready to advance to the next level of a more advanced training opportunity. And this, even though internship is potentially a term that's used more so in psychology and perhaps not as often or not in the same way in other fields, just thinking about that this is something where it's a more advanced training opportunity is a good way to get a sense of what we're referring to here. So your work as a mental health provider is showing actually observable adherence to these professional values that were mentioned under practicum. So we're able to check a box and say, yes, I see this trainee being honest, right? When they've made a mistake, they're coming to me in supervision and telling me about it. And it's great. And I can check that off. And also, one thing that we tend to see as folks are advancing here is that they are bringing to supervision instead of simply like, I don't know if anybody else did this, maybe just me. Initially, I really just wanted to impress my supervisor, and I would bring in all these examples of all the great things that I was doing. And they were fortunately very patient with me, waiting for me to get to that developmental place where I was more ready for internship and to bring material like, oh my gosh, these are the areas I'm really struggling, or I feel like I messed up here. And particularly that is necessary for entry into independent practice. As probably many folks here know, we need to be monitoring independently when we're feeling challenged, right? Our values or integrity are challenged. And so if we're able to do that and start bringing that into supervision in the more advanced years of our training, there's a positive trajectory to being able to do that as an independent practitioner. So I'm not going to go through each one of these lines, but wanted to just break it down with some very specific examples, at least within the integrity level. Okay, so other things we're supposed to be assessing and evaluating as we go. Because, that whole 45 or 50 minutes of supervision, we can do all million things that are listed here, right? So we are supposed to be working on collaborative supervisory relationship. Already talked in a lot of these slides prior, particularly the one on multicultural orientation, about why that collaborative supervisory relationship is so important and essential to have advancement through those developmental stages. So you all know, with clients, right? If they don't feel safe, they're not gonna grow, right? We got to feel safe before we can grow. Providing feedback, ideally in an ongoing way, and when we are hopefully able to observe them live. And I don't know about you all, but certainly for me, when we all switched over to telehealth in some capacity, that made observation of sessions a little easier because everyone could just click record. So that was really helpful in terms of, at least in our center, getting us all into compliance on observing tape. And I still call it tape. Gosh, it's dating me. Okay. So contract recommendations. Actually, Rachel, could you go back one slide? Thank you. Just to make sure I hit all of these points. So we want to make sure in our feedback that it is direct, clear, and timely. So, this is always a challenge when we're only potentially only seeing our supervisee once a week and we learn about something. How timely can it really be? But obviously, if we are experiencing something in the room with the supervisee, what a great opportunity to really give some direct and clear feedback in that moment. And that we are going to help support the supervisee in their own self-assessment, because of course, we're out in independent practice later in our lives. We're the ones who are going to be primarily assessing ourselves. So when we're giving an assessment of a supervisee, we generally are going to want to ask them to also self-assess. So fill out the same form that I am, but on yourself. And then seeking feedback. So similarly, every time that I give feedback to my supervisee, for example, with Rachel, Rachel's also giving me feedback as a supervisor. And that really helps to, I think, put into practice some of those lifetime developmental models that Rachel was talking about before, that, yeah, of course, I am still developing and a human being, even though I'm supervising, I am going to have areas for growth. And so modeling for the supervisee when they're giving me feedback, how I can receive that feedback in kind of an open and non-defensive stance, if possible, is really lovely. Okay, so one form of evaluation, or one form that is really necessary for effective evaluation and competent practice, is supervision contract. And so any of us who are supervising folks who are coming from a university training setting are going to be getting some documents that we have to sign, or someone in our practice is signing, or our organization from their training program. And those will include things like down towards the bottom of this first column, the processes and procedures for when the supervisee is not meeting performance criteria. So that is often coming from the university. As we mentioned in our conflict of interest statement, we do accept trainees here from pretty much every university in the state. And so we've got lots of different documents coming in to us. And oftentimes, I think, especially, I'll just speak for myself as a beginning supervisor, I was thinking, oh yeah, that's my contract. That is not my contract. So what the supervision contract is about is a document that I, as the supervisor, am going to give my supervisee. A lot like our informed consent documents in psychotherapy. There's certainly some elements that are like liability related, but also a lot of that is really laying the groundwork for an effective working relationship with our supervisee. It's really difficult to give effective assessment and feedback to folks who aren't aware, and it feels like, oh, it damages the relationship if they're not aware of what our expectations are. So if you think back to kind of that working alliance in psychotherapy, that I'm sure many of you are aware of, it's the alignment on the goals and tasks, and also the relationship in psychotherapy. And so that's really similar in effective supervision. We want to make sure that we're aligning on what are the goals of our supervision, what are the specific tasks that we're expecting of the supervisee, what can they expect from us as the supervisor, and then also focusing, of course, on developing a collaborative and open relationship. And so I find that talking with a supervisee, and I'll acknowledge, I'm mostly supervising licensed clinicians at this time. And so I was doing this talk like, oh, I want to take a beginning trainee again. I miss it. But when I was supervising beginning trainees, particularly, just talking about kind of how could you give, if there was something coming up in our relationship, how could you give me feedback? Acknowledging that there's a power differential, right? And often like an evaluative component. But for me, in my contracts with my trainees, I'm writing down, I expect, to see, I expect that I'm not doing things perfectly. And so I'd love to receive some feedback. And I also know that that is like scary and may not be where we're at developmentally. But if I do get some, like, that's going to be, yeah, wow, way to go. You did this, again, avoiding avoidance thing, and gave me some feedback on, one that I am often doing now that Rachel can attest to is running a little late or a lot late for supervision. And that might be an expectation that I've listed in my contract, that I'm going to arrive on time. It's going to be predictable. And I'm like, oh, dang, I am not adhering to that. That's something that I want to hold myself accountable for as a supervisor to raise in supervision and see what kind of repair, if anything, is needed, but also that I would really like slow clap to if a supervisee was able to say, hey, I noticed that you're like 10 minutes late. What do we need to do to address that? And that would really, again, in those columns of where is the supervisee at, those types of behaviors, being able to do something like that skillfully with the supervisor is something that's going to differentiate a beginning trainee from a more advanced trainee, right? So this is all the stuff that we want to include. Limits to confidentiality, expectations about disclosures. Here in UCBT, we tell our trainees, never worry alone. We really want you to let us know when you're worried about something going on with a client. Call me, text me, let me know. It's easier to shape up like too much communication than it is to get communication going, especially if shame's in the mix. And we know this, right, from working with therapy clients. Ethical and legal parameters. So all of these things are laying the groundwork for an effective relationship, and one where we are minimizing the risk of liability to ourselves, and also hopefully enhancing the likelihood for the supervisee of a really positive and supportive feeling, because they know what's expected of them and what will happen if they're not doing what's expected, because those are really scary things when they're not defined. And here is that link that I promised you. And don't worry, we're going to be sending these slides out to you. So you can certainly write down this Carol, the cfallender.com. She has so many great documents that you can edit. So this was like this one's a PDF, but there are some, I think, editable documents, but there are examples in here. And this is just a little mini screenshot to show you kind of what's on there of a actual. And I believe somebody put it in the chat for us. Thank you. So you can even click on that now and see the full document if you'd like to. But examples of what a contract could look like. And I'm hopeful that, you can take this away if you don't have a contract, or like you used to do contracts, but then things got really hectic. It's like, probably many of us can relate to that. And you're like, oh yeah, I really want to do that again, but it feels overwhelming. I'm hopeful that starting with a document like this, that's coming from one of our leading experts who led this task force, will be a helpful place to start. And then of course, limits that are in there, you're going to want to edit those to reflect what your personal limits are. There's no correct set of limits for what you want as a supervisor. And then, of course, Dr. Fallender is based in California. And so some of the things referenced in these contracts may be coming from a California orientation. And so you'll want to just make sure for your state that you've got anything really important in there, like these are the things I really need you to disclose because I'm a mandated reporter of these things. You'd want to maybe put that in there. So the most common way that we evaluate supervisees is a competency evaluation rating form, or a CERF. And these are the most frequent way that we do this in mental health. And that's because they are easy, inexpensive, and they at face value, we're like, yeah, this makes sense. They're face valid. I can see how all of these domains are related to supervision. The challenge with this, and I don't know if you have experienced this, and this is true with evaluations also, we're always trying to improve our staff evaluations, for example, of our licensed folks as well. And this is always the case with these evaluation ratings forms that have like a Likert type. We try to be behavioral, but you got to rate it from, strongly agree to strongly disagree. It has a strong positive bias that's influenced by trainee or employee attributes. And so that is kind of concerning, right? And this is true not just in mental health specifically, but also in medicine. So they've researched this across various settings. And there's also some research on this just in employment in general, right? That evaluations are so important, but there's also inherent bias when we're using these kinds of measures. But here's an example, and this is another one that you can check out in greater depth. The supervisor feedback form that's on Dr. Fallender's website. This is just pulled out a few of the bullet points, and imagine that there's like a Likert scale next to these. So did we provide, to be clear, this is an evaluation of a supervisor by a postdoc. So not of a postdoc, but it's important to get supervisor evaluations as well. So this is like for us as supervisors, did we provide an atmosphere where our postdoc could grow? And one way that we might have shown that would be establishing, so behavioral anchor, establishing clear and reasonable expectations for my performance, and they would rate that for us. And then my style. Did I admit errors or limitations without undue defensiveness? And they would rate me here, 0 to 5. Did I model professional behavior by keeping supervision appointments and being on time? I just said, oh, maybe I'm going to I would expect a little bit of a lower score on that. Okay. Impact of supervisor. Did I facilitate therapist confidence to accept new challenges? And so this is like one of those really, they have some other items in this measure that are about, did I adjust my style over the course of the year as the postdoc became more confident in the environment that they're in, more independent? Was I able to stop giving like really specific interventions that I wanted them to try? Or yes, go talk to this person about that problem. And did I sit back a little more and say, oh, tell me how you might handle that? If not, I might get a lower score, for example. And yet, like I said about CERFs in general, regardless of who's filling them out, whether I'm filling it out on postdoc, whether they're filling this out on me as a supervisor, there's going to be that halo effect, the likelihood that I'm going to get like all 5s. And I know that I'm not on time. I'm like, oh, I really want feedback so I can grow too. Okay. This is an example. And of course, evaluation materials are going to differ based on what theoretical orientation you're using, potentially, if you get to control that. And certainly some agencies will have forms that are needed to complete. I know universities have specific evaluations they want to use, but that doesn't prevent us from also including something that feels meaningful. And so this one is taken out of a measure for CBT supervision. And so if I'm a CBT provider, looking up this citation and getting some more data about the CBT focus measure that I might want to give for CBT-based supervision could be really helpful for you. And so some of the areas that they're particularly highlighting in CBT focused supervision is, was there agenda setting, demonstrating, giving feedback, receiving feedback? Did I do any facilitating, collaborating? And so those skills, some of them sound really universal to most supervision, but they may be using particular terms. If this was an ACT-based measure or an EMDR-based measure, we would have different labels probably for those terms, or for those particular concepts would have a different label. Yeah, so it's just an example. So this is really interesting, and this is a 2022 study, and one that I was not, I haven't experienced this yet myself. So I got to learn something really interesting and new here. Working in a hospital setting, I certainly was aware that objective structured clinical exams were part of nursing and med school. And this is where you go and you do like stations, potentially with hypothetical or clients or actors. And I don't know, again, I'll be dating myself. I don't know if any of you have ever seen Seinfeld, where Kramer volunteers to be a fake patient. And that's what that was. That was an objective structured clinical exam. So if you've seen that, you've actually seen one of these. They're starting to do this in psychology now and in mental health training, which is really cool. To be fair, this study happened at the Uniformed Service University, which is the in Bethesda, what was formerly Bethesda Naval Hospital, but is now Uniformed Services facility. So all military service members can go to this hospital. And consequently, they have a ton of funding for this kind of thing. This is why do we not do this? Because it's so great. There's so much great research on how much more objective the feedback can be. Maybe we could, could we collaborate with the acting school at the U and like get some actors down here? We could do some mutual thing. So I have ideas for how we could try something like this at UCBT. But in this particular study, they actually had a simulation center. So they've got just vignettes that are, you can interact, it's like AI essentially. So you're interacting with a client and then it's being recorded. It's a fake client. It's kind of like a choose your own adventure thing. So if you do this intervention, then the fake client says this to you. And then lots of different supervisors can evaluate that because they don't all have to be there because it's recorded. And so we get all this great data about inter-rater reliability on these types of evaluations. So when you can live observe someone doing a skill, and these are the scenarios on that second to last bullet point. They had an emotionally reactive / ethics case, a risk assessment and management case, a functional assessment, a treatment case, a testing interpretation case, a note writing case. I could benefit from that. Do I write? How does my note look? Does it reflect exactly what happened in that session? And a case related to diversity issues. And so they found in this study that they were able to differentiate the different levels, developmental levels and skill levels of the trainees with strong inter-rater reliability. So between people who are evaluating, they kind of were able to come to agreement across evaluators. And then also with a benefit of identifying G, even though these folks have been in our, I believe this is internship that they were focusing on, they actually really need more training in risk assessment and they need more diversity training. And so it's really helpful for their training department to know, gee, yeah, they can certainly seem like they've got these skills, but being able to observe how they actually react live. As you might imagine, there's a lot of anxiety associated with this by trainees, certainly in med school. I remember hearing about trainees from trainees when I was also a trainee, med residents talking about how stressful this was. But they found that the folks who completed this study, so the trainees, said, yes, it was anxiety provoking, but I got so much helpful feedback just knowing that someone had seen what I did and rated it. And now I feel better. So pros and cons. Legal. This is a really fun part. I spend a lot of time dealing with legal concerns. I get all the subpoenas for our agency. So I can't wait to talk about this. Before COVID, they used to give me a mint when they delivered a subpoena, but now, no more. Okay, so this is domain G, ethics, legal, and regulatory considerations about supervision. So we're going to want to model our ethical practice, and Rachel will be talking more about those ethical dilemmas, but because this is both ethical and legal, I'm just going to go over domain G, even though I'm only focusing on the legal part. We are going to protect the welfare of the client here. So you can imagine where that might be a dilemma. If like the supervisee needs something from us, maybe in our relationship, but the client needs something that's different, dilemma. That supervisors serve as gatekeepers to the profession. And Rachel will talk a lot more about that. That we provide clear information about expectations and parameters. And here's where you see supervisory contract come up again. So that is one really great way to reduce your risk of any legal or ethical concerns arising. If you could do one thing today, that's what I want you to do. Look at contracts. Supervisors maintain accurate and timely documentation of supervisory performance. So just important as it is with employees, we really want to be actually documenting as well when we're giving feedback. And even though there'll be informal feedback, we want to make sure that there's also formal feedback. Okay. So malpractice. This is professional misconduct or negligent behavior on the part of the practitioner that might lead to legal action. And people are often asking, and we may have even gotten this question, like, what's the difference between malpractice versus an ethical violation? There's actually really no difference. The only difference is whether someone pursues legal action against you. So if there's a ethical violation, but nothing legal happens with it, then it's an ethical violation. If it's an ethical violation and someone reports that and takes legal action, suddenly it's malpractice. So malpractice is a legal term. And for a successful malpractice claim, which from our stance is like not successful, so one that can actually harm us potentially as practitioners, there has to be a fiduciary relationship. So where somebody is like, I've agreed, so this is not just someone I walked by on the street, I actually agreed to provide some help or support to this person, whether that's my supervisee or a client. The conduct was improper, negligent, or falls below acceptable standards of care. And that's where things get like a little confused. Like, well, what is the acceptable standard of care? Is often a question. And when we've had folks in our center testify as expert witnesses, that's often what they're testifying to, is like, what is the standard of care here? And did this clinician who has a malpractice claim, did they meet the standard of care even though something bad happened, right? A negative outcome. Was harm actually suffered by the client or the supervisee? If not, and it's just like uncomfortable, or we wish it wouldn't have happened, but there's no harm by legal definition, that's not going to be a successful claim. And also there has to be a causal relationship that can be proven between whatever the negligent area was and the harm. So if it's just incidental, I guess there was harm, but it probably wasn't caused by this particular action, not a successful claim. Okay, one that we're all really familiar with is duty to warn. And I don't know, so this is that Tarasoff case that probably all of you, regardless of your professional orientation, have heard of, way back from 1976. One thing I didn't realize about this case, I thought I knew all the details, but I didn't realize it was about a supervisory relationship. I don't know, like, anybody else not realize this? So the supervisee here believed that the client was dangerous to a woman who was rejecting the client's romantic advances. And in concert with the supervisor, they attempted to have the client involuntarily hospitalized because the client did not want to go voluntarily. So they called the police because, of course, psychologists can't do that. And the police declined to hospitalize. And then the client just, of course, after that, well, not of course, but maybe able to expect, they didn't return to therapy. And the supervisor didn't want to do anything further there because they were worried about violating another ethical code about confidentiality, right? So they were like, oh, well, they didn't get hospitalized, but what am I supposed to do? I don't want to violate this person's confidentiality. And then 2 months later, the client went and killed the woman that he had been attempting to date. And California determined that a lawsuit could be filed on the grounds that the supervisor had a duty to warn or directly protect Tarasov. Another thing I didn't really know about this case is that it actually isn't case law per se, because it didn't go to trial. They settled outside. So the University of California system settled that case. So assessment here in terms of duty to warn, what we really want to take away, other than it's an interesting story, which it is that we need to assess the client's level of risk or danger. If it's assessed as imminent or high, we may have a duty to warn, and we need to also have an identifiable victim. So if it's a really broad, like, I just want to kill people, that's a hard thing to go warn people about, right? And you might be weighing there then, oh, well, if I just tell everybody, this client might want to kill people. That's definitely going to be a violation of confidentiality. So those are the two components that we would want to be thinking about. And liability. So in this case, the Tarasov case actually brings up this concept of what is the direct versus the vicarious liability. So liability, again, is a defendant's legal responsibility here in a situation where a claim has been made, a legal claim. Direct liability is when the actions of, in this type of a case, in a supervision relationship, a direct liability would be when the supervisor's actions cause the harm. So then I would be directly liable. Vicarious is like our worst nightmare, or mine, I'll speak for myself as a supervisor, when I'm being held liable for actions that I don't even maybe know about, actions that a supervisee took, because they are, of course, practicing under my license if they're unlicensed. And so in order for that kind of vicarious liability claim to be successful, again, that's a bad outcome for us, but a successful claim, that the supervisee has agreed to work under my direction, that they were acting within the scope of tasks that I said were okay, and that I actually had some power to direct, control those actions. So this is another one where the contract, why I'm like, do a supervision contract, do one, is because I am defining what the scope of supervision is there. And so if there is no contract, it becomes really hard to say, well, what would be the scope of the task? Maybe the supervisee thought I could go do all these other things that the supervisor didn't want me to. But if it's not spelled out, hey, no, you're not allowed to go do these other things, then it's more likely that there could be a successful claim for vicarious liability. Also, like whether or not I can control it. If I am directing the supervisee, here's what I want you to do in a crisis situation, and they are violating what I have asked them to do, they're not following what I have requested, that's going to be a little more difficult for a successful claim. If I haven't spelled it out and had them sign it and it's in writing, this is what the expectations are, those claims are more likely to be successful. And so here again are things you could do. Take away today. You want to reduce your likelihood of malpractice claims, do these things. There's actually research that these can be helpful and recommendations. We've talked about this a lot, that trusting, open, and effective working alliance with your supervisee. The more that you're able to maintain that, the more likely you are to hear about things that they may be worrying alone about, right? And then you can do something about it. Staying current, use that twice there. Okay. Staying current on legal issues impacting our profession, and legal consultation. So I deal with legal situations a lot, but I am not a lawyer. I have a really great lawyer that I go consult with in circumstances like that. So if I were concerned about a duty to warn situation or protect, I would want to talk with our liability insurance and our liability attorney to know, okay, is this one I need to go do this? Because it's a really tough place to be making a decision from without any sort of legal guidance. So we want to make sure that our organization or ourselves, if we're an individual practitioner, that we have appropriate legal support for malpractice. And we want to ensure that both supervisors and supervisees have separate malpractice insurance. And that's really important. Someone asked about that, I believe, and we do encourage supervisees to have their own malpractice insurance. I know I did as a supervisee. It was really inexpensive way back in olden times. It was like $50 or something. I don't know. Rachel, did you have this as a supervisee?
I actually don't remember.
Don't remember. Good for you.
Yeah.
I don't even remember that anymore. Yeah, so I just was not sure how much that would cost for supervisees, but for me, it was really inexpensive and just nice to know because as a supervisee, you want to make sure if there is that conflict where what my needs are not aligned with the supervisor, it's really nice as a supervisee to have that independent coverage for myself. Make sure that we are keeping records of what's happening. So if I'm consulting with colleagues, I'm writing a note down that says I'm consulting with colleagues about this issue and I'm consulting with legal. So documenting exactly what's happened, what I've told my supervisee to do, making sure the supervisee is documenting what they're doing, right? If they are the ones taking actions. And then an adequate self-care plan for burnout reduction. And we had a great talk about this about a month ago. And so if you want to know, well, how do we develop an adequate self-care plan and how do we manage our own burnout? I love talking about that, but for time, not today. So we have other materials on that, but it's really important to make sure that you yourself as a provider are not burned out. That helps to, or not continuously burned out because it's a spectrum. Okay. Moving over to Rachel.
Thanks so much, Robin. I do think now that I'm thinking back to it, I do think I had my own malpractice insurance as a postdoc at UCEBT, but I can't remember back as a practicum or practicum student or intern. Too long ago in my mind now. All righty. So yeah, we wanted to just kind of spend a little bit of time talking through some of the common ethical dilemmas in supervision. And when I was reviewing the literature on this, I actually found a lot of comfort because there are really similar kinds of like themes and groupings that were coming up, which made this really big, broad category of like any ethical dilemma in the land that could occur just a little bit more digestible. And so we're going to focus on some of those common themes today. And this is a place where I'd actually really love to encourage folks to talk through a little bit in the chat there, what kinds of ethical principles are you thinking about? Can you relate to this in your practice? I'm going to do my best. My multitasking skills and monitoring the chat and technology and going through content are being challenged today. It's like maybe a little bit beyond my growth zone. But just as a way to kind of engage with the material, I would really, really encourage you to kind of jot your thoughts down in the chat there. And we might even be able to talk through some examples if there is time and interest in things like that. So we alluded to early on how in supervision there are different ethical guidelines, and just wanted to return and provide those links for the broad ethical guidelines across professions. Like Robin mentioned, the APA guidelines on supervision really incorporated a lot from different professional identities and orientations. But as you all likely know, there are some distinct differences, or just rather like areas that get more or less emphasis across different professional organizations and identities. So I'm a psychologist. The APA guidelines are the ones that I was most familiar with. But when I was looking through the marriage and family therapy guidelines today, I thought it was really, or when I was preparing for the presentation today, I thought it was really interesting that there was like more of an emphasis on systemic and relational therapies, which makes sense, but both the advancement and competency and knowledge in those areas. Similarly, I know one of the things I always hold when I think about social work ethical guidelines is that there is more of that explicit valuing and emphasis on social justice principles. So even though as psychologists, we might be talking about those things, they're actually not as like explicitly outlined or emphasized in our own ethics code. As I mentioned earlier today, ethical decision making and learning to think ethically is really tends to be the general guidance. So I know when I've attended other ethics trainings in the past, I've had that wish or that urge, especially if there's like a higher stakes scenario that I'm in or something that's just, raising my suds level personally. I'm like, give me the answer. And so I just want to validate if any of you are having that wish or that urge today, like Rachel or Robin, please just give me the answer here. That I have a lot of compassion for that and both a wish to provide that. When I was preparing for today, I was like, this is what I want to give to people. And then also just that continuous reminder, both in experience and in the literature, that learning to think ethically and the steps through thinking through things ethically tends to be more of the guidance for a really wide variety of reasons rather than if A happens, do B. Part of why that is because of these underlying assumptions when we're considering different ethical issues, both broadly and in supervision. And one of the things I wanted to highlight is that oftentimes these ethical standards will tell us what to do, but rarely how to do it. It's also, like I mentioned here, an active and continuous process. And as Robin was alluding to earlier, the most complex clinical issues tend to occur when two ethical principles conflict with one another. So privacy and confidentiality versus a duty to warn or protect or a mandated reporting scenario, as an example. Another assumption that I wanted to highlight here, and both Robin and I come from a bit of a DBT background, so we're thinking about assumptions, probably both of us are thinking about assumptions as beliefs that we choose to hold but can neither prove or disprove that they are right or wrong. And so I was reminded of my DBT assumption, just because that was the first context I ever heard this word fallible in or fallibility in. And I was comforted finding that in the ethical literature as well, and the supervision literature as well, that when we're talking about ethical issues in supervision, we're really coming from a place that we're assuming human beings are going to be making mistakes. Since all of us as therapists and mental health professionals also happen to be human beings, all of us will inevitably be making mistakes. And when all of our supervisees also happen to be human beings, they will also be making mistakes. So this gentle reminder and assumption that mistakes are inevitable, even though we're still striving to do our best to benefit others and of course do no harm, mistakes will happen. And so again, when that happens, what do we do? But also thinking through different ways about how we handle that. I put this last one, this answers in quotes to ethical questions can be elusive and abstract. And so if you ask, 100 different people, you're likely to get 100 different answers. I always also like to start by thinking about kind of what background or orientation is that person coming from, because it's not wrong to respond in a psychodynamic or psychoanalytically oriented way, but it's certainly going to be different than a cognitive behavioral kind of way. And so if you're assuming one is right and one is wrong, or one is correct and one is incorrect, then you might be missing a little bit of that nuance to these different models. As we've been discussing, the supervisory relationship is a persistent theme throughout all of these different areas, and specifically that's referenced in the APA guidelines under Domain C. In these guidelines, supervisors are asked to really value and seek to create and maintain a collaborative relationship that promotes supervisory competence. Part of my, as I'm looking through this, my part of my presenting is covering up some of the text here. So I'm going to do my best here. Aspiring as I think Robin actually already talked about a lot of this stuff anyway. So aspiring to regularly review the progress of the supervisee, the effectiveness of the supervisory relationship, and address issues in a timely manner as they arise. And going back to number 2, identifying those expectations and evaluating the competencies and performance standards, and individualizing those learning goals. You'll notice that these are the kinds of these are some of the different kinds of multiple relationships that we're going to talk about today, or some of these broad categories. But again, there are probably a lot of different kinds of themes that are out there. So the first I wanted to mention are dual relationships. A dual relationship is when an individual or professional is in 2 roles simultaneously or sequentially with a person seeking help. I interpret this in terms of seeking help that to me gives more of a client context, but that's true in the supervisory relationship. And I certainly am seeking help when I'm a supervisee. And there's a bit of a duality that exists here because on the one hand, dual relationships are generally discouraged, but on the other hand, they are also believed to be inevitable. So Robin was talking a little bit earlier about how she is my supervisor as well as my boss. She supervises me both on administrative tasks and responsibilities that I hold at the center, as well as on clinical tasks. And my role is both administrative and clinical in nature. And so it's hard to imagine how that would be generally discouraged on the one hand, or how you would enforce discouraging that kind of relationship. And at least in the context of our center, it is unavoidable. And I imagine many of us either are working in or have worked in contexts where that's quite similar. And so rather than focusing on like, can I do this or can I not do this? I think there was a question earlier on about befriending a current or former supervisee, having them over to your house or going out for a drink, rather than being like, yes, you can do this, or no, you can't do this. What the literature really emphasizes is focusing much more on deciphering if or when a multiple relationship is or becomes problematic or develops into boundary violations. There are also 5 different categories that are referenced in the literature about different kinds of dual relationships. And I don't actually know if it was intended to be in this way, but certainly when I look at that bottom one there, the predatory professional relationship, I'm like, it makes me think, oh, it goes from good to bad, or less bad to worse, or something like that. I don't actually know that it's intended that way, but I did notice like those kind of, certainly the last one, and then some of what we'll talk about in the others, it tends to get a little more scary and anxiety provoking for me, certainly. One thing that's important to know about these different categories is that they are classified on behavior rather than the development of the relationship. So Robin and I have been through several different iterations of my role at the center. Your role has actually changed, in a variety of ways at the center as well. But even though our relationship has developed from postdoc to licensed clinical person at the center, licensed clinical therapist at the center, and then to anxiety and mood program director, really when we're talking about where a problem or an issue might occur, it really has to do more with those behaviors than it has to do with any kind of title or particular shift. So circumstantial or coincidental relationships are believed to be inevitable at times due to coincidence or unexpected circumstances. One example I found in literature is if a friend enrolls in a counseling program where you work and supervise, and you end up supervising this friend during their practicum or internship experience. Small Lake City, that can definitely happen. I believe, have had that happen at the center, or things that are kind of closely related to that before. And the part that makes this challenging is really being able to, is because of the uncertainty about which relationship is in effect at the time. So am I your friend or am I your supervisor? And with my role changes, I've had experiences in the past where I've been friends at a peer level, and then somebody's role has shifted, and I've been in a supervisory context, and or vice versa. The recommendation here tends to be around prioritizing communication and addressing explicitly any confusion that might arise about this kind of relationship. Structured multiple professional roles are also considered to be inevitable, but are actually considered to be a pretty integral part of the professional role, and are quite common both in the educational realm as well as in clinical supervision. They're thought to be complementary to one another and not necessarily a source of conflict or contention, but like Robin was talking about before, where issues tend to arise is when there, first of all, is a power differential, and then second of all, when that power differential isn't explicitly discussed. So if a supervisor was taking advantage of a supervisee, knowing that that supervisee would be very likely to agree with the supervisor because of that power differential. So as Robin and I were preparing for our presentation today, if she had been pressuring me to do more of the work to prepare for this presentation, I might have a really strong urge to say, oh yes, definitely I'll do that, because I know she has this. Because there's a power differential between us, and she has an evaluative. I mean, we do back and forth evaluations of one another, but there's an evaluative component to our relationship as well. Like I mentioned before, this can also occur when there are shifts in the professional role. For example, let's see, a prior student is hired as an employee, or if a client were to become a coworker, there can be definitely shifts that occur. And similarly to the others that were mentioned, issues tend to arise in this area when either party denies that there's a power differential that exists due to that pre-existing relationship. And one recommendation that was given when this kind of category of multiple relationship happens is to seek out a neutral party to help resolve conflicts or issues when they arise in these kinds of roles. That question that we had before around personal and professional role conflicts maybe is alluding a little bit more to, can I be friends with my supervisee? And can I see my supervisee outside of the therapeutic context and that kind of thing? And this tends to occur when there is either a pre-existing professional relationship that's followed by a personal relationship, or vice versa, a personal relationship that's followed by a professional relationship. The different kinds of dynamics that can occur, again, also can really influence, is this right or wrong? Is this okay or bad? That kind of things, because the relationships can be social in nature, they can involve peers, or they can be sexual in nature. So you'll notice that we're kind of getting closer to that scary predatory professional relationship category here. And what's crucial in addressing these kinds of issues is that that professionals be really forthcoming in talking about their various roles, limitations, and issues in the relationships that might arise. And just to be really clear, the predatory professional relationship is when a professional concerns themselves solely with their needs and intentionally seduces or exploits others through various means, financial, sexual, or otherwise. And in this type of multiple relationship, the professional in this context would need to be confronted and either rehabilitated or removed from the counseling profession. Oh, I had a slide on this. I was thinking, gosh, glad to hear it. Just to briefly address this, this is specifically addressing that role as both clinical and administrative supervisor. And there's some cool literature on the benefits of that. So it's less financially costly, it may save time, it increases contact. So when I'm meeting with Robin for supervision, it's really nice to be able to kind of fluidly discuss both administrative and clinical needs that I might have. And it also helps with more effective administrative oversight and coordination. So as we're changing policies and procedures and those kinds of things, it's easier to roll those out and be able to have somebody to talk to if you have any questions or confusion about those kinds of roles. There are, of course, some drawbacks as well. It can further exacerbate any power differential that exists. I've definitely run into this before where it can be easy to focus on administrative tasks and either avoid or distract from more challenging clinical content. And then, as we were talking about before, another place that avoidance can come up if there is any shame or anxiety or fear of disclosing a mistake. Because of fear of any kind of financial or administrative consequence. And I'm just noticing our time here, so I'm kind of wrapping up and going through here quickly. Perhaps related to that question around secondary traumatization and supervision. But one of the reasons why it might be difficult to maintain that boundary, and one that passes the logic test for me and certainly mirrors my own experience in graduate school, was there are a lot of barriers to trainees seeking their own therapy. Those include financial limitations, concerns about confidentiality. So is your therapist somebody who's in the community that you also work in? And oftentimes stigma, even within mental health graduate programs. Some of those barriers that have been studied and reviewed have to do with graduate programs in particular not providing therapy resources, so difficulty finding those resources. I have had this experience before, getting a list of resources and then those resources being out of date. Or certainly resources not being financially accessible. And so as a supervisor, both as a supervisor and as a supervisee, it might feel easy to kind of drift into that role and worry a little bit more about a particular boundary crossing, and just a lot of compassion and empathy that it can happen subtly. It's not like somebody wakes up one day and decides, like, I'm going to start providing therapy to my supervisee. But I know for myself, my mind is thinking in those therapeutic modalities. And so Robin and I have certainly had discussions before where I've gotten consultation and support in how to best provide resources to folks that I'm supervising when my spidey senses are tingling that, gosh, I worry we're about to slip into therapy territory, or I worry there is a need for therapeutic support that I cannot provide because I'm the supervisor, of course. So I would strongly recommend consultation in this area as well. And I'm sorry, we're running out of time here for today, though we did do a pretty good job, honestly, managing time today. But just that to mention that additional dual role that supervisors are also gatekeepers This relates to domain F and professional competency problems, I think is what it said. It's just this problem and then cuts off. And again, just a lot of compassion, because it is difficult to both be a compassionate, supportive, and engaged supervisor and simultaneously provide objective and accurate evaluation and feedback. And some of my most difficult experiences, both as a peer to people as well as a supervisor, have been when there has been a need for some kind of gatekeeping function. I do have some recommendations for you here, so I encourage you to read through those. Those felt very grounding to me personally and assuring, but certainly talking through and getting consultation and maybe supervision of supervision could be useful in those instances. All right, here are our citations that Robin alluded to.
If you'd like to know more about our events, please go ahead and check out our website where you can sign up for our mailing list. We only send out, I learned, I think, 2 messages a month. So it's not one that's going to jam up your inbox, but it will let you know about whatever kinds of training opportunities we have coming up. And as we mentioned before, we are getting a lot of requests from our participants for more time and more interactive presentations where we can really work on an area like supervision in greater depth. And so that would be a great place to get information about those when we get them scheduled, if you all are interested. And I think that might be our last slide. Is that it?
I think that's all we've got today, but this was a real pleasure. Thank you all so much. And thank you, Robin.
Yes, thank you so much. It was so fun to present with you, Rachel, and great questions, both during our talk and also in advance. So remember, in upcoming talks, when you're signing up, there's a place where you can ask a question in advance. We make sure we answer it. And if anyone has lingering questions or wants to learn more, needs some more consultation, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Both of us love supervising and love talking about supervision and would be happy to communicate with you all further. Take good care. Bye.